Hi, my name is Jackson Morris, and this is my senior year's teaching and learning presentation on my 4 lesson plans, my responses to feedback and improvements to those plans, and my teaching sequence video. My primary goal when I was creating my literacy and numeracy focused plan was to provide an authentic and relevant learning experience for students to become more familiar with some of the numeracy techniques and mathematical literacy terms required to create an effective budget. I find that a focus on literacy in this lesson and the topic of financial maths more generally is important, as mathematical literacy is often neglected in maths classes, but it is critical when you're trying to complete financial activities. This lesson focuses in on key financial literacy terms to assist students in aligning these mathematical skills, such as income calculations and budgeting, with activities that they might do when they move out into the world following school. With respect to my feedback on this lesson plan, I received quite a lot, as this was my sample lesson plan that I provided to get feedback on. The first piece of feedback I got was to consider using a hook in the introduction. However, I don't believe that any meaningful hook could be provided in the time allotted in the lesson. It is necessary for students to be familiar with the calculations they were going to be required to perform in the primary activity, the budgeting activity for the lesson, and a sufficiently engaging and relevant hook would likely disrupt this if not placed at the end of the warm-up, so it didn't really run into this. However, if I was going to deliver this lesson, I would likely make a quick comment to students stating that there would be a more interesting activity for the lesson that is required, that they be comfortable with the calculations covered in the introduction. My second piece of feedback that I responded to was I changed that piece of text from working full-time to full-time or part-time to allow students to create a budget if they were planning on going into university studies, to try and keep this as relevant as I could to as many students within a given class, while still giving them enough parameters to work around to sort of make it clear as to what I wanted from them in the lesson. My third piece of feedback that I responded to was making my learning goal more explicit, following expert feedback. The fourth alteration that I made was to reword this to more student-facing terminology, and I also added Centrelink allowances to my list of budgeting considerations, to once again add a bit of realism into the task where I could. I also, with my feedback responding, I allowed students to pair up in the budgeting activity to possibly create a bit more engagement with them, as it might be difficult for some students to do this as a solo task. And it also gives the students an opportunity to have some further discussion between themselves and maybe get a bit more value out of the activity that way. The sixth alteration I made to this lesson was I added timings to the side of the lesson plan to sort of give a bit more of an idea of the flow of the lesson. In general, however, I feel like timings in a lesson such as this would be greatly subject to the class that it's being delivered to. For example, I can see the budgeting activity running really close to the end of the lesson if students are finding a lot of value out of it, and it might just be more valuable to them to continue working on that activity rather than have a more formal conclusion to the lesson discussing findings and whatnot. I also added in an additional reflection question at the end of the lesson plan to address the numeracy component of the lesson, to make sure that this was also something being considered in the lesson, because I felt, and the expert feedback that I got was that I needed to make it more clear that this was a numeracy lesson to students, so I added in an extra question to address that. So that just means that I will be putting a high emphasis on that in the lesson mentally as well. With my higher order thinking strategies lesson, I largely built it around utilizing cognitive verbs to develop questions to guide students through a project based learning sequence. So, in the lesson, students are asked to play the role of a team manager and perform a statistical analysis on two players and to make a recommendation on which would be better for their team. And my cornerstone questions are presented to students to guide them as they move through this process so they don't get lost. They also serve as a mental organizational tool for the teacher, so then you can have a clear understanding of what you're hunting from the students. And it also assists in creating informal questions as you're moving around the class and questioning students on how they're going with the task. The questions were built upon the cognitive verbs associated with Bloom's taxonomy of thinking, although they primarily lie within the higher levels of thinking due to this lesson being positioned at the end of a content sequence. In general, my responses to feedback are somewhat limited for my 3 remaining lesson plans, as I found that the feedback I received on my literacy and numeracy focused lesson was largely specific to that lesson and couldn't really be applied very well to my other lessons. Although I have attempted to apply some elements of the feedback I received where applicable, I also made some adjustments to the lessons as I reflected on them over time. So the first improvement that I made to this lesson is I added timings for a similar reason to the literacy and numeracy lesson. In general, I believe it can be difficult to accurately time a problem-based learning task like this, particularly in the early stage of the career that I'm at, in my career that I'm at. I think it's a useful mental exercise to keep that in mind, though, as you move through these extended lesson sequences. The second alteration I made was once again akin to my literacy and numeracy lesson, and that is that this lesson lacks a solid hook to engage learners. For similar reasons, though, I feel like it is difficult to respond to this feedback due to the nature of the lesson. This is certainly something I'll seek to do a bit better in my future lesson planning. The third change I made is that I included a requirement of a Venn diagram for students to produce in the lesson. I did this to help alleviate the cognitive load for these students and give them a deeper understanding of what their calculations are telling them when they're moving through the project. And then the final change that I made to this lesson was adding a definitive time frame for students to choose their players so that they wouldn't waste a significant proportion of the lesson choosing those players. It also helps at a more macro level to structure the different sequences of the lesson and checkpoints that will be hit during the activity. My pedagogical content knowledge focus lesson was designed as an introductory lesson to calculus for students, aiming to get students to think deeply about the fundamentals of derivatives and calculus more generally. It is largely built as a collaborative lesson, with students being the primary driving force behind classroom discussion. I've also utilised a YouTube video as the central resource for this lesson to engage and encourage more thought about the topic by students. The nature of this lesson allows for the content knowledge of a teacher to shine, as it enables the teacher to guide students towards an understanding of calculus in a more subtle manner than what you would otherwise be able to do with direct instruction. It's really all about trying to get students to believe as though they've discovered this topic or this mathematics without them actually having to do that, and you're sort of helping them along on that process. I only had one adjustment which I made to this lesson, and that was adding in an additional check for learning. I believe that this check in particular works well for this lesson as a barometer for how much intrigue was generated amongst students throughout the lesson, which was the lesson's primary goal amongst others. It allows you to see if you were effectively able to get students interested in the topic, which was the main goal of the lesson. For my ICT strategies focused lesson, I utilised graphing software on student devices to increase accessibility for different function and graph types. So this allows for more instant feedback to students when they explore graphing that would not be possible through just using pen and paper and having to redraw graphs all the time. This use of technological visuals also allows for the lesson to be more collaborative than it otherwise would be, so you can have graphs sitting up on the board to help students with that. In general, I tend to lean more towards collaborative learning strategies and lessons when particularly reviewing visual math topics. I believe I do this for two reasons primarily. The first is that collaboration is often something that is neglected in more traditional methods of teaching mathematics, despite collaboration generally being quite high in mathematics, both in a scholarly and in an everyday sense. For example, like family budgeting might be done as a group. The second reason why I did this is that with the lesson being built more around visuals, students gain a common understanding of the topic through these visuals. So unlike in more typical maths lessons where a student may become entirely disengaged due to a limited understanding, when visuals are featured prominently, each student in the class gains a universal understanding of the content. In this lesson, for example, each student is able to identify how a given functional graph is moving across the board, regardless of whether they actually understand the mathematics behind why that's happening. Likewise, for my other lessons, I only had a single addition to this lesson, and that was introducing a check for learning to occur throughout the lesson. So this helps with keeping students engaged throughout the lesson and also gives students some greater onus over the concluding activity where we review several different function types.